With this class defined, the first step to make Django aware of it and to get Django to work on the database and set up that table and so on is that we need to register the app in which we registered this model. Because it's a bit like with templates. Out of the box, Django doesn't know that you have this app and that you have this model. So out of the box, it's not doing anything. Instead, we need to go to our project settings, and there in installed apps, we need to add the book outlet. That was my app name, which I picked. We need to add this entry here to make Django aware of our app, and then Django will also automatically pick up those models in there. But that alone is still not enough. Now we need to tell Django that it should reach out to the database. So in this case, to this database file, which it supports out of the box. Django supports SQLite out of the box. That it should go to this file, and that in there, it should create such a table. It should create that data table for the books. And we do tell Django to do this with a concept called migrations. And you might have noticed this migrations folder before already, though it is empty out of the box if we leave that init.py file aside. Migrations are a feature which basically defines steps for Django to execute, steps that will touch the database and manipulate it. For example, by creating new tables or updating existing tables. And therefore, whenever we work on our models, when we add models or update our models in the models.py file, we need to make sure that we create migrations for Django to execute, so that we create those instructions for Django on how to update the database, and that we then also run those migrations. We have these two steps, creating the migrations and running them, which we always need to perform when we worked on our models. And to do that, we open up our terminal here, navigate it into the project folder, not into the app folder, but in the overall project folder. And in there, we'll again use the manage.py file. And the first command which we need to execute there is make migrations. If we run that, it goes ahead and now it populates the migrations folders of all the apps where migrations are needed. In this case, of the book outlet app. And you see in there that it added this 0001 initial.py file. In there, we have some Python code, which was auto-generated by Django, which now describes the operations Django should perform against the database. It didn't perform those operations yet, but it's about to perform them. We could manipulate the code in here, but for that you should really know what you're doing, and typically you don't want to manipulate it. Instead, you want to work on your models and then make migrations whenever you change them to let Django create new migration files for you. Now, if we have a look at this initial.py migration file, then we can see that in the end, a migration is just a class extending the migration class, which comes from Django. That then it has this initial flag telling Django that this indeed is the first migration to be executed ever in this application. Dependencies of which we have none here, and then the operations that should be performed. And in the end, this is one of the built-in operations Django offers that will go ahead and create a table, and the table will then automatically be named books, as I said. That's the auto-naming Django will basically do here for us. And it will then create three fields in that database table, title and rating, with the char field and the integer field. And, as I mentioned, the ID, which it automatically creates for you. And primary key simply means that this will then also be optimized behind the scenes so that it's a bit more efficient to query it, and that uniqueness is enforced. So that this field, even if we would want to override it, can't assume a value of an already existing record. Now with that, we created the migrations, or in this case, the single migration. As I said, nothing was done yet though. Nothing was written to the database. To do that, we need to run another command here in the terminal. We need to run with manage.py migrate. And that will now tell Django to have a look at all files in migrations folders in all apps and run all migrations that haven't been executed yet. So in this case, this initial PY migration hasn't been executed yet. So if I run this command, you see Django now executed a couple of things. It actually did more than just our initial migration. You see that was also applied, but you see that also a couple of other migrations were applied. And that simply happened because this was the first time I ran the migrate command. And you must not forget that in our Django app, we have more installed apps. We have a couple of built-in apps which are also installed for working with sessions and for authentication. And some of these apps also require database tables to work correctly. We haven't really used them thus far, which is why we had no problems up to this point. But they will need some tables to work correctly in the future. And therefore, when we migrate for the first time, all those built-in migrations of those built-in apps, which we don't see in our project folder, but which exist, also were executed. Now, our migration, as I mentioned, also was executed. And therefore, now our table, our database was updated. Now, we don't see that here because this file type is not supported out of the box by Visual Studio Code, because it's basically encoded in a way that can't be read like this. It's not a regular text file, but this SQLite free file will now contain the database setup which was created based on all those migrations. And with that, with those steps taken, we can now in the next lecture get started with working with that database and with those tables. And we can start with inserting some data.